name is Ashley Bortner.
I'm Renee Franchi.
We both were former employees at the York County District Attorney's Office. I was a victim witness advocate for about 4 years.
I was one of the prosecutors. I started my career doing some other work, worked at the prosecutor's office for about 5 years, did some civil litigation, and now I'm doing civil victims work. So Ashley and I worked together, actually directly together for a few years, and unfortunately our colleague Teresa, who was supposed to be here also for some time, worked with us at the prosecutor's office. Unfortunately she's ill today, so you're stuck with the two of us, but we both talk for a living, so we'll try to not bore you and fill up the time.
Yep, so I apologize if the slides, I did go in and edit them a little bit this morning just so I could take out, things that Teresa would have been talking about. Like Renee said, she was also a prosecutor at one point, so if there are any specific legal questions that I'm unable to answer when we go through the criminal side of things, I'm not an attorney, so I can't answer those legal questions, but Renee can definitely hop in. I'm here to talk more about the criminal justice system overall, the processes, and what different advocacy groups can do for you. All right, so we'll get started then. We just went over who we are. So, like I said, in this session, we're going to talk more about the criminal side of, what happens after any type of incident. And we'll talk today about the different types of crimes that can happen, how those are investigated to when they are brought to a close, and then also talking about the different support mechanisms within those systems and then outside of those systems as well.
And so both of us work in Pennsylvania mainly, so a lot of what we'll be talking about is Pennsylvania specific, but a lot of the ideas and concepts and just how things are handled do often cross over, but...
So while the terminology might be specific to Pennsylvania, what we're talking about, like Renee said, the ideas do branch out into other states and even federal systems. So what is domestic violence? I think that a lot of the crimes that I've worked with, it's a very difficult topic for people to talk about, so I want to make sure that also before we get started that everyone knows that obviously your well-being is the most important thing here today. So if at any point anything that we talk about gets to be too much, gets to be a little too dense or emotional for anyone, please feel free to take a break and come back. It's not going to offend us if you walk out of the room. So domestic violence, the dictionary definition is the willful intimidation, physical assault and battery, sexual assault, or any other abusive behavior that is part of a systemic pattern of power and control perpetrated by an intimate partner against another intimate partner. It includes physical violence, sexual violence, threats, economic and emotional or psychological abuse, and the frequency and severity of domestic violence varies dramatically. So what does that mean in layman's terms for people who don't have, a Juris Doctorate? Basically, domestic violence is a way for one person to keep control and power over another person using whatever means necessary. We talk about domestic violence as a cycle of abuse because normally when you first become partners, you're in their honeymoon phase and things are great, and you don't realize the destructive behaviors of your partner until it is too late. And why I put that in air quotes is it's really never too late. It's important for, and I will use gendered terms because a lot of times it is specific to women. Women are the most likely victims of domestic violence. So I'm not saying that men cannot be, but if you hear me saying she a lot during this, that is why I use those gendered terms. So it is never too late. It is important to speak out against things like this, and that's what we're here hoping to accomplish today, is to show you that the criminal justice system, while it seems massive and scary, hopefully by learning a little bit about it, it takes away some of that unknown and what makes it scary. So back to domestic violence. Basically, it is a cycle where things get bad, and then there's an apologizing phase where things seem like, oh, he's going to change, things are going to get better, and then you have that honeymoon phase again where things are great. A lot of times these abusers will use gifts or bringing you flowers or doing nice, kind things to try and keep you in their grips, so that the next time that they abuse, or we call it reoffend in the criminal justice system, you are more likely to stay, because there's really high highs and then there's really low lows. And those types of techniques are what abusers use to keep you under their grips. And it is all about power and control. That is the dynamic that we see. The idea of, I love you so much that I have to do these things, you make me do these things, is just their way of manipulating and trying to keep you in a situation. It is not love. Someone who loves you does not put their hands on you. Someone who loves you does not keep financial control over you or emotionally abuse you, try and put you down. I think we went too close together.
I mean, I'll sit further away if I have to, but...
Oh no, I can't move this a lot. So another thing I forgot to go over is, at any time, if anyone has questions, please raise your hand. I'm happy to answer questions during the presentation, and then also we'll have time at the end for questions as well. So domestic violence is unfortunately a very okay, go ahead. Awesome. I was going to say I can repeat the question, or...
We also have a mic here.
Awesome.
If you have a question, so go ahead.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I just wanted to mention that we also see a lot of spiritual abuse and academic abuse. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And I think that's a good kind of segue too, because any type of crime of violence, domestic violence, child abuse, violence within the home, it's not only physical, it can be mental. Mental abuse is just as, and sometimes even more damaging than physical abuse, because wounds can usually heal. A cut you can put a Band-Aid on and it can heal, but mental wounds are, can really do a lot of long-term damage. And I think that, what you were saying, and I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but I think that was a really important comment, that, spiritual abuse, physical abuse, any type of abuse is abuse. And I think that that's something that people need to know, that, even if somebody isn't hitting you, isn't hitting their child, isn't hitting their partner, it doesn't mean they're not being abused.
Yeah, the term abuse doesn't discriminate. These overarching ideas of the power and control dynamics and the manipulation that happens within the home can obviously also happen outside of the home to try and keep you under someone's sphere of influence.
And I think, and I'll let you go in a minute, but I figure we can kind of go back and forth and make this a little bit more of a dialogue. And since Teresa isn't here, we'll do what we can. And again, especially crimes within the home, when we say domestic violence, it could be, with a partner, or again, it could be children, it could be anybody within the home. And those types of crimes are particularly difficult too, because it's within the home. And within your home, it's a private space.
You're supposed to be safe.
It's hard to talk about. It's hard, I'm sure, and we have a detective here, I'll call you out in the back of the room. I'm sure it's difficult to investigate because crimes within the home people don't want to talk about. It's hard to prosecute because it's hard to tell a jury, you need to look inside somebody else's home and judge what happened there. So it is particularly difficult because of how private it actually is. And again, the detective, if you disagree with anything, since we don't have a third person up here, if you have any comments, please feel free to jump in.
You're right on what you're talking about. It's very difficult.
And I'm going to flat out tell you, it's embarrassing. And I can't tell you how many, and I'm going to use moms as my good example. Say the mother is remarried, or even if she's been married a long time, and her partner abuses her children or their children. It's horrific for them. I mean, it's horrific for them. There's a different level of guilt, and for them to have the courage to talk about what's happening in the home is extremely personal, and a lot of guilt that goes along with that.
And I think that it's also important to know that, people, and I'll say people meaning adults, children, men, women who are facing any type of abuse often feel like they are powerless, that it's embarrassing, as the detective had said.
A lot of shame involved.
Yeah, but I think it's important to know that speaking out against abuse, being able to use your voice to protect yourself and protect others does not mean that you're weak. In fact, it's the opposite. Being able to talk about it just shows your strength. And I think that it's important to know, and I think that it's often misunderstood. People think, if I tell somebody that I'm being abused, they're going to think that I'm weak, and it's not true. Right. It's the opposite. We have one question, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Or comment.
Good morning. So do you think that for Amish and Anabaptist communities, because of the cultural teachings of forgiving or being silent, do you think that affects in any way how they navigate that?
I definitely think that even outside of, the Amish and Mennonite communities, there is a very large culture of silence where people are, shamed into believing that, and I'm not saying that anyone did anything to deserve this, but a lot of times the idea is, I did something to deserve this, or your abuser has manipulated you to the point where you believe that it is your fault or that no one will believe you. And I think that even, especially in a cultural system that does promote that, or does promote forgiveness, or, dealing with things inside of the home, a lot of cultural groups believe, it's important to deal with things inside the home. Let's not bring outside people in on this. There are times where, you can't get past the criminal justice system, and it's important that someone is held accountable in that way, not only for, someone's safety, but for other people's safety. So I think that the way it should be looked at is this is for the greater good, and this is affecting people, not just inside my house. This could affect people outside of my house too. So for the greater good, it is important that people have charges brought against them and are prosecuted to the fullest extent. Again, I know, and we're going to go through this today, about how it's not always the most comfortable thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do. However, there are processes and groups in place to make that easier for you and to make it as comfortable and safe as it can possibly be.
And I think when you talk about forgiveness, I think that it's important for people to know that just because you're holding somebody accountable under the law doesn't mean that you can't forgive them. The law is the law, but you can still exercise forgiveness and still hold people accountable under the law. And I think that a lot of people don't know that. And maybe, and I can't speak for everybody, people from different faiths, I'm sure, and everybody even within their faiths or outside of it have their own beliefs, but the law is what the law is, and if you want to exercise forgiveness, that's fine, but you can still hold somebody accountable under the law and not have people make you feel guilty or gaslight you or make you feel bad for doing so. And I hope that kind of covers what you're
I do have one more question.
Sure.
Does forgiveness equal silence?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Does forgiveness equal silence?
No.
Thank you.
No, absolutely not.
All right, so I'm going to jump forward a little. So we were talking about domestic violence. Same thing goes for child abuse. Unfortunately, it is a very common crime here in Pennsylvania and across the US. You can see the numbers on the screen. This is also something where, you know, these are things that people deal with inside of their home. It is a domestic situation. I'm going to skip past these a little bit just so I can go more into how we deal with these in the criminal justice system. And again, child sexual abuse kind of goes along with child abuse as a branching topic. So before we get into the steps that a case will follow in the criminal justice system, I want to talk about some words that I'll be using so that you guys know what they are and can understand throughout the rest of the presentation. There are a few different types of advocacy groups that can aid you in, you know, being a part of this criminal justice system. There are systems-based advocacy groups. So here in Pennsylvania and almost every state in the United States, there is an Office of the Victim's Advocate. It might go by different names, like we said earlier. Our terms are Pennsylvania specific, the ideas are overarching. So the Office of the Victim's Advocate here in Pennsylvania is appointed by the governor. It is a state-run program that helps victims of all types as a whole in the state of Pennsylvania. They are the best people to reach out to if you have questions about, you know, where you can seek other resources. So while they might not be the first point of contact that you have in the criminal justice system, they are an important organization to know about because they work for the entire state of Pennsylvania or the entire state of wherever you're living, and they will have the best information about, you know, local groups, community groups, systems-based groups in your area that can help you out. Also under systems-based advocacy groups are more governmental organizations. So like I said, I was a victim witness coordinator at the district attorney's office in York County. So I worked for the district attorney's office. I was an employee of the county, and there are also in different counties in Pennsylvania, there are systems-based groups within the district attorney's office, and we also see them in sometimes in police departments. So say Pittsburgh is a larger city, they actually have their own victims advocacy group within their police department. Important things to know about systems-based groups is they are the people who are working closest with police and prosecutors who are doing these investigations. So when you're talking about dates for your case, when you're talking about plea negotiations or, you know, what someone is eventually going to be sentenced to, these are the people that have all that information. These are the people you want to reach out to. Now, not every county or police department has these groups, and if they do not, the police or the prosecution should be taking that role on and making sure that your rights as a victim are not violated. Also being said, the Office of the Victim's Advocate in Pennsylvania determined what the non-negotiable rights for victims of crime are. We'll talk more about that throughout the presentation, but just know that there are things that you as a victim have the right to know. And again, we'll get to that a little bit later. Okay, so then comes to community-based organizations. Community-based organizations are usually not-for-profit organizations. Almost every county has a YWCA, which is a women's center that has advocates for either domestic violence, human trafficking, or child abuse cases. And they are usually at least partially grant funded, which means that some of their money is coming from the state. So they too have to make sure that they are operating under a certain set of standards and confidentiality to you. Underneath that, also a community-based organization, you also have some culturally specific groups. So we're here talking, about specifically crimes committed within the Amish and Mennonite communities. There are groups that cater to you specifically. I can't sit here and say that I understand people's life experiences in groups that are culturally different than mine. So having advocacy groups that do understand your lived experiences is important. Same thing would go with people who, might speak a different language. There are a lot of, specifically for Hispanic and Latino populations who speak Spanish, they have specific advocacy groups for them because they operate culturally on a different level than, the rest of the population.
And I think one thing that is really important to keep in mind is that victims groups, whether they are government-based, private, or community-based, any type of victims advocacies, if they're putting themselves out as being a victims advocate, their only job is to protect you or protect the victim. Victims advocacy groups or victims advocates, from whatever point you look at them, should not be trying to push their own agenda. They shouldn't be trying to gaslight you. If at any point you are seeking the aid of a victims group or a victims advocate, again, whether a community-based organization or a government organization, those are red flags.
Right.
If you believe at any point that your victims advocate is not advancing your best interests, pause. Call somebody else. It is very, very important to know that they should not be gaslighting you. You are their focus. And if it looks like their focus is on anything but you, go somewhere else.
And we do have a few, after we talk about the criminal justice system, I do have a few slides on, what you can expect from victim services groups, what is good, what isn't good. I will say definitely on the topic of that, the other thing is a true victims advocate will never, ever tell you not to seek any other type of help. Mm-hmm. So it is important to know that a true victims advocate will be constantly trying to refer you to other places to fit your needs. Mm-hmm. It's important that you have the best and largest support group or support net that you can. So if any group is trying to get you to not talk to police, not talk to any other type of advocacy group, red flag.
Yes. Yes. Are we doing microphone, or you could shout?
If you just say it, I can repeat it so that it's heard.
Okay.
Okay.
Hi again. So I just wanted to you're talking about culturally specific groups, and before when you were talking about power and control and domestic violence, many of you would be familiar with the power and control wheel, and I just wanted to mention there are power and control wheels that talk about abuse for many different types of groups, like deaf community, people that are immigrants, but we happen to have the one here today that's for the Plain and Amish community specifically. That was created by conversations with survivors from the Amish community in Ohio, mm-hmm. and so that is here today if anybody's interested in it.
Oh, that's
and
wonderful.
It's also available electronically.
Okay, thank you.
That's great.
And I think also when we talk about culturally specific groups, power, control, and abuse can be very different from group to group. If somebody is an atheist and doesn't believe in any sort of God, generally somebody isn't going to exert their power over them by saying, if you don't do this for me, you're going to hell. It doesn't mean something to that person. But if you're within a culturally specific group and somebody is gaslighting you and you truly believe, and they make you believe, and they're exerting their power over you to say that if you don't do what I say or you don't succumb to my power, then X, Y, and Z spiritually is going to happen to you, then that could mean something vastly different to people in different groups. So I think that it's really important to know it depends on who you are. And just because abuse looks different from one person to the other, or power and control looks different from one person to another, doesn't mean that it's less relevant. everybody is different.
Right. And it's important so like I said, in the systems-based organizations and the kind of broad topic community-based organizations, it's important to look for groups that are at least partially grant funded. And I say that because, like I said, there is some oversight from the government there. There is some, there will be a statement about confidentiality and what they can and can't discuss about your case. So I'll say specifically for the criminal justice system, my spiel whenever I meet a person for the first time is, I'm here to talk to you about this. I just want you to know before we have this conversation that anything that we talk about will not be shared outside of my office. However, I will have to talk with police and prosecutors about anything that we talk about, just so we're on the same page about how things are going to work, what our relationship will look like. And that's something that any group should be able to tell you about, is how they approach the idea of confidentiality or not sharing things outside of who you would like things to be shared with. So it's very important that you know about the confidentiality of a group and what they're willing to talk about in other people's presence. So you want to make sure that they're going to keep things private that you want them to keep private. So moving on to the steps in the criminal justice system. You can see here kind of an overview, and we'll go into more detail about each one. So an incident occurs. Now what happens? There are different ways that police can be alerted to an incident. Say you call yourself, so a person within the party that the incident is occurring in calls and says, I have an emergency situation here. There are also sometimes non-emergency reports where a situation has already happened and the report is delayed. Outside of that, police can become involved after a mandated report comes in. I know that Renee is going to touch on that a lot more in her civil session later today, so I'll keep that kind of brief. But basically, a mandated reporter is someone who works for a school, works anywhere where children are. They could work for a daycare or a summer camp, and a child discloses to them, this abuse happened to me. Those mandated reporters do not have a choice. They have to report that. And with a report, sometimes police involvement is necessary. Another thing that could happen after an incident occurs if police aren't called right away is you seek out an advocate and talk with them. So I do want to be very clear about systems-based advocates. Like I said, they are responsible to share any information that they know with the police or with prosecution. If you aren't sure yet about what you'd like to do, or if police, if this is something that you want to elevate to the level of police being involved, first off, if your safety is in immediate danger, 100%, please call 911, please get police involved. It is very important that you do so. But if something happened and you're not sure where you want to go with this, and you seek out an advocate, they operate under different rules of confidentiality. So they are not going to go and tell police what happened. So if you need someone to talk to kind of hash out what happened and decide what you want to do, a community-based organization would be a good place to start, so that you have someone who you feel safe talking to about things and won't, automatically result in a criminal prosecution. I see we have a question back here.
Yes, I wanted to elaborate on mandated reporters. They also include healthcare workers, counselors, therapists, church leaders.
Yes.
And failure to report when you're a mandated reporter is a crime in itself.
Yes.
And recently there has been a prosecution of an Amish bishop in Lancaster County who failed to report abuse within his church.
Yes, absolutely. And again, later on, we have some slides that also go directly to mandated reporting. And yes, and We will talk about it now, we'll talk about it later. It is very important to know. Mandated reporters must report. And if they do not, there are consequences. It is the law. And if you have a person who is deemed to be a mandated reporter and they try to convince you don't report this, or they don't report it themselves, that is a problem and it is against the law. They should not be working against you to cover up abuse.
These are people that you or your children should feel safe around. And that is the reason that they become mandated reporters, is because they're working in spaces where children are. So it's important to know that there is that level of trust and duty to report in any type of position where you are a mandated reporter.
And I think it's, as we're talking here about, when an incident occurs, to report it. I see that there's somebody who wants to speak. Before I lose my train of thought, I just had a thought. It's never too late.
Right.
So don't think that, just because my abuse happened 2 years ago or my child's abuse happened 5 years ago, it's too late. It's never too late. And being able to report it, and even if you're not comfortable the day it happens, if you're comfortable with it years later, say something. And I'm sure the detective could also, again, I'm sorry I keep putting you on the spot, but you're here. So I'm sure, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, I'm sure you would rather have somebody report abuse 10 years later than not report it at all. And sometimes there are reasons within the law why, even if you report some abuse, it can't be prosecuted. It could be, it's after the statute of limitations, the perpetrator is deceased. Whatever reason it is, I can tell you 100% that any investigator and any person you talk to would say, go report it anyway, because even if there is nothing they can do within the law at that time, they can take a report. They'll keep it in their files, they'll have it in your system, so when that person goes and abuses somebody else, there's already a report that the detective has taken that says, you know what, this happened before. And I can tell you that if somebody is abusing you, if somebody is abusing your child, almost every single time, if they have abused one person, they have abused someone else.
It is cyclical, and it is, again, there is nothing wrong with you as a victim. It is everything to do with the abuser. They have issues within them that will continue to cause them to abuse over and over again in different spaces.
Thank you for allowing me to go on my tangent.
If you are aware of a mandated reporter that is continually failing to report, who do you report that to?
The police.
If the victim's in a different county, if the actual abuse happened in a separate county from where the mandated reporter failed to report, I'll say my opinion and then you can correct me if I'm wrong. To me, that's two separate crimes in two separate counties. So the failing to report would be the jurisdiction under where those people actually failed to report. Is that correct?
I think if you're talking about what a victim should do if somebody fails to report, I don't care where you are, you call whatever police you can reach in your jurisdiction. It's not your job as a victim to be able to figure the system out. It is the system's job to make sure that the victim is protected, the victim is safe, and the community is safe. So even if it happens in another county, another state, another time zone.
More specifically, in the unlicensed facilities, most often that they are mandated reporters by Pennsylvania state law, which you're aware of, but they very rarely, they put it off on each other. They say it's the church's responsibility, the church says it's their responsibility, and some of them are coming from states away. So very often, the abuse has happened in a different state, but their failure to report has happened in Cumberland County. To me, they should be held accountable in Cumberland County for failing to report. And go ahead.
So you were talking about, placing the blame. That is why mandated reporting laws are as strict as they are. Anyone who works, or anyone who hears about this, anyone who works in that overarching organization that is required to report is required to report. There is no, I heard about this, but I've never actually put a child line in, so I'm gonna tell my boss to do it. No, it is your responsibility. If you hear it, you're the one who's reporting it, even if it's secondhand. So multiple people from the same organization could end up having to make those reports. So not filing one at all is absolutely illegal. And like Renee said, it's important to get that information out there to whoever you are able to. So if you want to call your local police department because this happened, if you want to call the police department where this incident occurred, it's not your job to figure that out. And if they can lead you to, the better person to make a contact to, they can do that as well. But telling someone is better than telling no one.
I'm sure there's something about the legal system that I don't understand, that I've seen this play out many times, where we know that there has been a failure to report, and that failure to report gets reported, and absolutely no charges are filed. And the preachers get away with maybe a verbal warning. What is going on when that happens? Because in my view, Mennonite preachers need handcuffs on if we're going to break this.
Well, so are you saying that it's been reported to police or reported to other people within the church community?
Reported to police, or you have a judge who says if this ever happens again, we'll deal with it.
There is a lot that goes into criminal investigations, and especially if that initial disclosure of abuse to whoever the mandated reporter is, if that's coming from a child, and this is also something that we'll talk about later, children are interviewed in a different way than adults are. So in most places in Pennsylvania, they're taken to a children's advocacy center where they are asked non-leading questions. So they're not having words put in their mouth. And sometimes the person who's taking them to those meetings is the person who was their abuser. So they're less likely to disclose because it's someone within their immediate household. So without police having that evidence, that knowledge of the abuse happening, it does end up being difficult for them to move forward with charges if they don't have enough evidence to bring charges forward.
And I also, I hate to say this, sometimes the system does fail people. I mean, it does. It happens. And it doesn't mean that you don't report it, or if there is somebody who is supposed to report it, a mandated reporter, and you report their failure to report and nothing happens, sometimes that happens. And I hate to say that, but sometimes the system does fail people, but that is the reason why you speak out. And if it doesn't work that time, you tell somebody else and you report it to somebody else, because there is one thing that every person has and every victim has that nobody can take from them, and it is their voice and their ability to speak out. So if you think there has been an injustice and there is a preacher, a healthcare worker, or somebody who has failed to report, and you report them and nothing happens, use your voice. Report it again. Tell somebody else. Nobody can take your voice from you, and I think that is just something that is very important, that, and we have seen it. Yes, the system sometimes fails people. Sometimes the system works the way it is and the consequences just aren't what people want. Right. And sometimes that is the sad fact of it too. Sometimes an investigator might go and, hear that somebody failed. I keep pointing to you, I'm so sorry. But see, this is what happens when we lose one speaker who can talk about this more. I'm gonna point to the other person in the audience who can. Sometimes within the bounds of the law, there isn't anything they can do, but it doesn't mean that you don't report it. You use your voice and you report it. And if there is an injustice, you tell somebody else. So I hope that helps. And I know that sometimes that's the worst lawyer answer is sometimes the system is broken, but we all know sometimes the system is broken, but that doesn't mean you don't try to follow it and you don't advocate.
I saw another hand over here.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, so what we run into a lot is we report and to children, youth, and the first thing they do is report to the CCI, which is our culture, Amish men that are set up to help the victims, but they help the predator. And the children and youth the last two reports we have made, children and youth has actually shown up with an Amish man in the car from the CCI.
That's
and
a
what
problem.
happens is they will all go inside. And the last case, well, not the last case, but one of the cases, the Amish man told children and youth to go outside, and he talked to the Amish woman. It turned out horrific, but what really ticked me off, I thought we could depend on the law. Obviously we can't, and that has stripped us. It was awful. However, I'm not one to quit. So everyone has a boss, Thank you. But everyone has a boss. So obviously, children, youth, whoever they are, I want their name, and I want their boss's name. And I got to the boss, well, she was in the CCI's back pocket. So obviously, she probably has a boss too. So you go to that boss. And that lady is horrified what I'm telling her.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's thank you for coming out and telling us this stuff. We have a voice and we need to
Yes.
use it.
You are
Again,
your own best advocate
and again,
at all times.
and again.
And I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. If you have a group, whether it's a CCI group or any other group that is saying, oh, don't worry about it, we'll take care of it, and that doesn't go directly to the police, that's right. Full stop. Yes. That is a problem. That is illegal. That is not okay. And unfortunately, we see this within a lot of very closed off communities, whether it's the Amish community or any other closed off, it could be anything. A lot of times, the CYS, the local police officers don't know, and they do need to be educated. They cannot know what they don't know. So if you have a detective who goes into a community and everybody is saying, all is well and good here, nothing to see, no problem, they can't know what they don't know. And that's what is so important for everybody here and everybody within the community, that you reach out, you talk to your local police officers, you talk to your local district attorneys and educate them. This is what is going on. This is why this group is gaslighting victims. This is the problem. So, and thank you. And thank you for using your voice, and thank you for standing up and really pushing and knowing that there is an injustice and that something needs to be done. And I know as a prosecutor, former prosecutor, not anymore, former prosecutor, and as an advocate or as a police officer, you need to know things because you can't know what you don't know. So if you think that within your community or within your household or within your group that there are, the people who are there to serve you or the people who are there to help you aren't doing what they need to do to best serve your community, talk to them, tell them. Because the only way it's going to get better is if you use your voice and use it to educate the people around you. I can tell you that, as a prosecutor, or I'm sure you can say as a victim's advocate, if somebody says to me, and even now doing a lot of, being as a civil attorney, I have learned so much about the Plain community, so much about people that are so different from me. I mean, I grew up, I didn't grow up in Pennsylvania for sure. I grew up in Massachusetts. And, every community is different, but I've learned so much, things that I was like, I had no idea that these are things that I didn't know, but I listen, I want to know, and I want to learn. And if your police officers or your victims advocates don't want to learn, then go somewhere else and talk to somebody else.
It is okay to continue shopping around until you find the best deal.
Yes.
Yeah. And I know there's another question really quickly before we get to the other question, just so that we all know what is proper procedure. Anytime that you make any type of report, you should be able to talk to someone privately. So you make a report to CYF, you make a report to the police, they should be speaking with you in private. There should not be anyone else there to hear what you are saying to them. And if for some reason that is not how it's going down, use your voice. Let them know that you'd be more comfortable speaking somewhere else.
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that.
So mine's not so much a question. So I'm from Ohio, so mandated reporter in Ohio. And whenever I have needed from my job to make a report to Children's Services, is what we call it out there, we always make a report to the sheriff as well. Like, we're doing 2 reports, one to Children's Services and one to the sheriff. I don't know how that works in Pennsylvania. That was just a curious question.
Here in Pennsylvania, we use what's called Childline. So, it's either, I just apologized.
I did that the other day. I walked into a door and I said, sorry. And I was like, oh, that's a door.
Here in Pennsylvania, we use Childline, which is actually a physical telephone line. You can call in and report to someone who works for Childline. You can also type it into the computer and send it as an electronic report. Those reports actually come directly to the district attorney's offices here, and it's decided how they'll be divvied out. So if it's a investigate only, which means that it's only going to CYF, or it is something that needs to go directly to law enforcement to be prosecuted, So again, it is going to be different everywhere you go, but that is our process here.
Well, and also, I mean, how many people are going to remember, like, oh, I have the number for Childline just written on the back of my hand. Sometimes you don't have it. But one phone number that everybody is a universal truth. If you don't know the number for Childline, you don't have access to the internet, call 911. That's right. So just make sure it gets out there to someone. So, they're not going to say, sorry, you didn't call the Childline number. Right. You called the dispatch for 911, therefore we can't make your report. That's not how it happens. So if it's in Ohio or West Virginia or anywhere, whatever system it is, if you don't know directly who it is you should report to, call 911.
And fun fact, even as a professional reporting, there have been times where we call 911 and they say, don't you know to call the local number? Like, it happens, it's ridiculous, it should not happen, and it happens to professionals too. It's not just you when you're trying to talk to them. It happens. People don't always do their job.
Yep. I think the issue is there's a lot of overlap in what different groups do. But again, you as a victim, if someone is hearing what you're saying, even if they cannot help you, they should be able to refer you to the best place to go to. And if they're not doing that, shop around.
Yes, and if you are a mandated reporter, you report to another mandated reporter, they must then report what you are telling them. If you are a victim and you're reporting to any other type of mandated reporter, they then must report it appropriately. So the water keeps trickling downhill. So as long as the information gets to where it needs to go, then.
All right, I'm gonna move on to the investigation stage. Some of this we kind of already touched on through the questions. So once law enforcement becomes aware of a crime occurring, they have to then build their case. They have to look for evidence. They will do that in a few different ways. They can do that by interviewing witnesses. This is another interject where I'm going to tell you about victim services. So if you do not feel comfortable speaking to police alone, request that an advocate be present. I can speak from personal experience at the District Attorney's Office in York. I sat in with multiple survivors of sexual assault on their interviews just as someone there as a support system. They then can gather physical evidence. They have to submit that for lab analysis. And a reason that that is important to know is that this is not always a very timely process. There are things that happen and there are processes that go on in the criminal justice system that take time. So if there is physical evidence that has to go to a lab for processing, that puts a backlog on the case. So know that things are being done, but you might get frustrated at how long things take. There can sometimes be digital evidence. If there are medical records to be had, the police or prosecution can request those. And like we said, there are forensic interviewers that interview children through, children advocacy centers.
And I actually had a point about that. When we're talking about forensic interviewers for children, a forensic interview is only a child and the interviewer. If anybody else that you are working with tells you that they're going to sit in on it or they're going to ask questions for the interviewer or they're going to answer questions for the child, that is not a forensic interview. A forensic interview is set up through specific centers, and if you have anybody else claiming that it is a forensic interview and there are other people sitting in or there are other people trying to get involved, that is not a forensic interview. And I think that there's a lot of times where people try to, I'm not going to point out anybody specific, but if you have a group or a person or an advocate saying, oh, I'll sit in with you, let me tell the interviewer what happened, wrong. That is, it's
has
frankly,
to come from the victim's mouth, and in this case, the victim would be the child.
Yes.
I just want to make a
please.
clarification because I am a forensic interviewer.
Yes.
Yes, most of the time, however, we do have occasion, well, obviously we have like people that speak Pennsylvania Dutch, like
Yeah,
our
right.
interpreters.
Interpreters, right.
But then also sometimes if we have DD children or something like that, we
Yes.
might have their aide or somebody that works closely with them. But yes, best practice, absolutely by
Yes.
themselves.
If there's a language or communication barrier, obviously someone else will have to assist.
Correct.
All right. After an investigation occurs, then there comes the time to decide whether or not charges can be filed. Again, like we said, unfortunately, there are times where, something happened, we know something happened, but we can't prove it. So charges cannot be filed. However, we're going to move forward talking as if charges are going to be filed. So again, the prosecutor has to decide that based on the elements of a crime. So when you look at Pennsylvania statutes, there are certain items that a prosecutor or a police department has to tick off before they're able to file charges. And charges can vary in severity. So there are things as low as a summary violation, which is kind of like a traffic ticket. If you got pulled over while you were driving and you weren't using your blinker, it holds that kind of weight. Above that is a misdemeanor, which is a little more severe. And then comes felonies, which are, things that you have to disclose when you get a job, you lose the right to vote. They're very severe crimes that come with harsher penalties, all the way up to homicide, which, carries even harsher penalties.
Yeah, and as we keep saying, I know we're kind of harping on it, but it's important to remember and to keep in mind, if you report something, if something's investigated and charges aren't filed, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And that isn't the investigator's way of saying, I don't believe you, this didn't happen to you. But sometimes there are reasons why, even if something occurred, even if you are a victim, even if there was abuse, if charges aren't filed, it doesn't mean that you weren't a victim. There are sometimes reasons within the law why things cannot happen. So don't, if you yourself are a victim.
Don't let us discourage you.
Yeah, or if you are advocating for a victim, even if charges aren't filed, it does not mean that it didn't happen.
So after charges are filed is the first time that you're going to have court. So that person is arrested and charged with these crimes. The first time that you will meet, if you have a systems-based advocate, you'll meet them at the preliminary hearing. The officer who filed the charges will also be there. This is the time to show a judge of a lower court that there is enough evidence for the case to move forward past this checkpoint. So basically, all that they have to show is that a crime occurred and that the person who is charged is most likely the person who committed that crime. It's a very low burden of proof is what we call it in the criminal justice system. So basically, we just have to show those two things and then the case gets moved forward. There are different things that can happen at this time, and if you have an advocate there with you, that's why it's important for someone to be there with you to explain this process to you. Because it can be confusing, and it's always important that you're well informed about what's going on. So this sometimes requires a victim to testify at this preliminary hearing level. And testimony would be very short and very brief at this level because, again, we just have to show that a crime occurred and that the person who's charged is most likely the person who committed that crime. So there'll be basic questions that are asked, again, to just tick those boxes that say, yep, these charges make sense, let's move forward. If you have to testify at this stage, it is very important that you, again, use your own voice if you don't have an advocate there with you to let the officer or the prosecutor know that, I want to know what's going on. If we could go over some questions that you might ask me, just so you're not feeling nervous and like you don't know what's going to be happening. Again, it is important to feel informed throughout this process. After that comes arraignment, which is kind of a formality, at least here in Pennsylvania. Basically, the purpose of arraignment is to have a judge of the higher courts or the county court system say, here's what you're charged with and here are the penalties that you're facing. Moving forward. The pretrial conference is probably what I would consider to be one of the most important stages that a criminal case takes. At this pretrial conference, the defendant, the person who committed the crime, will have to make a decision. Are they going to say, yes, I did this, and plead guilty? Or are they going to say, no, I want to take this case further to a trial? At this time, if you have a systems-based advocate, this is the time that you want to be asking them, or if you don't have an advocate through the DA's office or the police, you want to ask the police officer or the prosecutor, are you planning to let this person plead guilty to anything lesser? And that is your right as a victim to know if charges are going to be reduced or if the offender is going to take a plea that is not within the guideline range of sentencing. So when we talk about sentences in Pennsylvania, they're set by the state legislature. So your elected House of Representatives and senators, they're the people who chose what penalties can happen for each crime. So it's not always going to include jail time. Sometimes it's going to be probation. If it's a summary offense, an even lower offense, sometimes it's just going to include the cost of prosecution and a fine. Now, it's important to know that not every criminal charge is going to have the same penalty, like I said. So when you're looking at those guidelines, let's say that you're charged with aggravated assault and the guideline range sentence is 4 to 8 years. I'm totally just making this up. Please do not quote me on anything that I'm saying right now.
They're going to write down and say, Ashley said it was this, and she's wrong.
So say someone is charged with aggravated assault, and the possible penalty that they're looking at is 4 to 8 years. Now, if the prosecutor in the case says, there are some factors in this case that, maybe we don't see us winning at trial, or maybe, they're called mitigating factors, things that, make this different or possibly lesser than those 4 to 8 years. So say the prosecutor wants to still have someone plead guilty to aggravated assault, but for a term of 2 to 4 years instead of the 4 to 8 years. You, as a victim, have the right to be notified that that is going to happen, okay? So when someone is charged with a crime, in your eyes, they're going to be charged and prosecuted for the highest offense, and that should be a guideline range sentence. Now, if the prosecutor wants to change that, they want to say, actually, I was thinking 2 to 4 years might be more appropriate in this case. You as the victim have the right to know that. You as the victim also have the right to know if you're going to go down from an aggravated assault to a simple assault. So if they're going to get rid of the lead charge, you have to be notified of that.
And not only does a victim have the right to know, you have the right to disagree.
Yes, and that's
And if you disagree, disagree.
Yes. It's important to let the prosecutor or the police officer or your victim's advocate know that you don't agree with that. There's also a time for you to say you disagree in court. So it's important that you know what's going on so that you can make that informed decision about how do I feel about this? Where do I think would be an appropriate sentence? What do I think would be appropriate charges?
I think that also reminds me kind of, and I'm sorry, I can't see name tags from here, but the young woman sitting 2 tables back saying about somebody getting a slap on the wrist. Sometimes, even if people are prosecuted to the letter of the law, and I don't know the circumstances of the case that you were talking about, but sometimes the consequences seem like a slap on the wrist. But
you have to pay a $300
But sometimes that is what the law tells you to do, unfortunately, and there's nothing you can do about it. But that's also, advocate to change it then. If, there are, plenty of times where, say there's a law that is, somebody can't do this type of crime and, everybody agrees that the sentence is completely inadequate. Advocate. Talk to your local representatives. See what you can do. The louder the voices, the bigger the group, you can advocate for that change. But unfortunately, there are times where, an investigator might charge somebody with something and a prosecutor might look at it and say, I would love to send this man to jail for 50 years, but the law says they can only get up to 6 months. There is absolutely nothing they can do about it. But as a victim or as an advocate, or as any type of interested party, if you feel like, or you say, this sounds wrong, this doesn't seem right, it seems like a slap on the wrist, ask. Because you have a reason, you have a right to know what is going on.
And a right for it to be explained to you,
yes,
why things are happening the way they are. So that brings me to a victim impact statement, which is in the profession of a victim's advocate, the best time, the most powerful time to use your voice. So basically what'll happen is if that person says, yes, I'm going to plead guilty, or I'll move forward, if they take the case to a trial and they are found guilty in trial, you have the time to tell the judge, hey, here's how I feel about all of this. Mm-hmm. And that is an open platform for you to say whatever you want to say.
Yes.
So say you don't agree with the plea deal that the prosecutor is putting on the table, say that. Say, I don't think this is enough. Here's how this affected me and why I think it should be more. Now, this can happen in a few different ways. One, you can do it in an oral format where you're speaking to the judge and saying, hey, this is how I feel. You can do this written, so you can write a letter. And then you could either, if you and the prosecutor are on the same page, you can have the prosecutor read that for you, or you can submit it to the judge to read silently to themselves. Now, it should be known that most court proceedings, unless you're dealing with an offender who's a child, a juvenile, they are public forums. So there will be other people in the courtroom, and that is something that it's another good reason to have a systems-based advocate or a community advocate with you so that they can be there to support you and help you through making that statement. If you're not able to continue reading it because you become too emotional, someone else can be there to, pick up where you left off. And it's, like I said, the best time for you to use your voice. I have seen personally with my own eyes where judges will say, what are we doing here? This is not acceptable. I do not agree with this either. We're not doing this. Let's take the case to a trial because I think this person should also get a higher penalty. So your voice does matter. Mm-hmm. I can't say that, I can't speak for a judge, I can't speak for a prosecutor, but I've been in the courtroom when people make those statements, and it is extremely impactful. Mm-hmm. It is emotional for everyone, and I can only imagine how difficult it is for a survivor to get up there and speak their piece in front of, a courtroom of people that they don't know. But it speaks volumes about you and your character and your willingness to advocate for yourself and make sure that your voice is being heard in all of this. Mm-hmm. It's personally, like I said, I think one of the most important things you can do.
And even sometimes it's not just in front of people you don't know. Sometimes you are speaking in front of people you do know. Mm-hmm. And there are times where I've seen it where a defendant will stack a courtroom full of their people to try to intimidate a witness. First of all, intimidating a victim or a witness is a crime. If you are a victim and you have a defendant or you have a defendant's people acting on their behalf trying to intimidate you, that is a crime. Illegal. That being said, if you are a victim and you are giving your impact statement or you are just in a courtroom and the defendant is stacking a courtroom full of their people and you feel intimidated, tell somebody. These hearings, they are open to the public. They have a right to have people there, but you also have a right to feel safe. So again, if you feel uncomfortable, say something, and it's so important that just because they have, say I'm gonna have all these people here to intimidate the victim so they don't speak, use your voice. You know what, let them hear it then. They have 30 people there to support the defendant, fine. That is 30 more people to hear your story. And I think that you can turn that negative into a positive and use it as a moment of empowerment. But if you don't feel safe, or if you think that they are there to intimidate you, tell your detective, tell your victim witness coordinator, tell the prosecutor, because
the sheriff's deputy who's there to keep the courtroom secure.
Mm-hmm. There are even some groups that actually, and I'm not sure. Yeah, there are some groups that you can actually contact that will send people to the courtroom with you so that you have a team of people there with you.
So there's a group here in Pennsylvania, I'm sure it's a nationwide thing, like Bikers Against Child Abuse. They will send big, intimidating, burly men in their leather biker jackets to come in and sit around a victim of child abuse so that they feel safe and secure in a courtroom or, really wherever they're needed. And there are other groups that do that too. That's just the one I'm most familiar with.
All right, question, comment?
So, could you back up a little, just a smidge, and talk about, explain why so many defendants plead not guilty, even if they were caught, I think it's important to understand, if 400 people saw commit a crime, they're most likely still going to plead not guilty.
The reason, bottom line, because they have a right to do so. And sometimes they will do whatever they can to try to not take accountability, and unfortunately, it is their right to do so. And sometimes they make it as difficult as possible.
Yeah. And like Renee said, it's another tactic. Mm-hmm. It's another tactic to intimidate or manipulate you in some type of way so that you're less likely to want to go to a trial. Trial is hard. I'm not going to sit here and say that it's easy to get up there and tell a jury of your peers what happened. It's not fun. No. I can only imagine how difficult that is. And if they think that you're likely to not want to testify, then they will drag that case on as long as they possibly can. Even if there's video of them doing it, there's 6 witnesses, we have physical evidence, they have the right as a defendant to have a trial and to be proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt. But it's a power and control dynamic where they will continue to try to manipulate, intimidate you. I've even seen where in stalking cases, a defendant will actually use court appearances just as a way to see that victim again. Yep. I had a case where, he said, I want to have the hearing, until the victim got in the room, he saw her and he's like, okay, we don't actually have to have the hearing. Yeah. So it definitely has to do with the issues they have going on and how they believe that it's going to affect the victim in the case. That's why they often drag on cases.
Could you also speak about in Pennsylvania, at this point, would there be any protections for the victim?
At this point where we're at now, would there be any protections for a victim of domestic violence or other violence, some kind of temporary protection or anything to do with the criminal case where there might be I know Ohio, so I don't know what protections there might be at this point.
Through domestic violence cases, there is almost always, when charges are filed, a no contact order put in place, which means that the defendant is for no reason to have contact with that victim. And that usually lasts at least until the preliminary hearing point of the case. Additionally, outside of the criminal justice system, there are protection from abuse orders. That is a civil proceeding that happens where you basically go in front of a judge, say, here's what happened to me. They will put that order in place, and those look different for different people. So the strictest is to have absolutely no contact for any reason whatsoever. But there are certain times where, again, we're human beings in the criminal justice system. We are not here to, try and make this terrible for you. So if you have shared children with an abuser and you have to continue exchanging custody, there are ways that they can modify a no contact order, which again is criminal, or a protection from abuse order, which is civil, to say, hey, we understand that you guys are gonna have to exchange, but if you are going to exchange, let's do it in a public place. Let's do it with a witness present, things like that. Because again, your safety is of the utmost importance, but we are human beings and we understand that there sometimes has to be some type of contact.
And I know, I'm not sure in Ohio if it's called a protection from abuse order. Some places it's called a restraining order.
Yeah.
It could just depend on the state, but.
There's a temporary protection order
Okay.
as part of a criminal case.
Okay, okay.
But we have to know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that actually just made me think of something else. Oftentimes in child abuse or in domestic violence or any type of abuse cases within the home, there are often times where the abuser is the sole means of someone's support. And that is another thing that is scary, it is intimidating, and another way to have power over their victims is when an abuser is this woman or these children's sole means of support. People are, so many times I've seen it, and I'm sure anybody who's worked within the system has seen it, where people are afraid to come forward and say, I was abused, because they're going to say, I'm going to end up homeless. My children aren't going to have a bed to sleep in. We're not going to have money. I don't have the skills to have my own, keep my own job and make money for my family. There should be, and there are, as long as the system is working the way it is, to help people with that.
Yes.
To remove, either have a place for you to safely go with your children, or to be able to remove the abuser from the home. But it's the number one reason I have seen, at least in my experience, and I'm sure that you have, and the poor detective in the back who I keep pointing to has seen, where people, will say, I was abused, and then a couple days later say, you know what, I wasn't abused. I'm just going to stay here because they're too afraid to be without this person. Or it's a woman who has, an 8th grade education and doesn't have the skills to have a certain job, or maybe within your community or within your religion, women don't work, or any number of reasons. But please, if you are being abused, if your children are being abused, or you're advocating for people who are being abused, please do not allow that to be the reason why you stay, because abuse is abuse is abuse, and it is not okay. Sorry. Yes. The poor microphone man just runs.
So while he's walking over, just another thing to add on to, a lot of community-based advocacy groups and organizations do also have domestic violence shelters. So when you are first talking with a police officer, they almost always have a protocol where they will have to tell you about these services that are available to you, and they will let you know, hey, if you're not feeling safe to stay here tonight, there's somewhere else that you can go. And that could be short-term or long-term. There's a bunch of different groups that do a lot of different things. Yes. But the officer that you initially speak with should know about those resources for you.
Oh, actually, hold on. Sorry, I just had a thought. So, and this actually was something that when I was speaking with Hope Ann, when we first began communicating, that I think is also important for people who are working with victims, or anybody who's within the system. If you are advocating for a victim, especially within certain closed communities or people with language barriers, to be able to say when they're speaking with a police officer, or say a child was sexually abused, say that a child was raped. Sometimes that child or the people within that community don't have the language they need to say, these are the technical terms for these certain body parts of mine. So if you're an advocate for somebody within this community, it is important that you educate the interviewer, the officer, whoever it is, and say, just because this individual is saying, I was molested, that could mean anything. Tell them they don't have language for these body parts, or this person doesn't speak English as their first language. Use your voice to let them know, because that's oftentimes another reason why, investigators can be frustrated, or people, charges don't go forward, because if a child or a victim doesn't have the language or the technical terms to say, X, Y, and Z happened to me, they're going to say, well, no crime was committed. So I think that's...
It is your right as a victim to have a translator if you need one. So I know that you were talking about people who speak Pennsylvania Dutch as their language. It is required that they provide you with a translator to make that initial report or, moving forward throughout the criminal justice process. Okay.
So my question was, how would you empower a mother that is in a situation and she all those fears faced her, that, she has an 8th grade education, she wouldn't have money, she wouldn't have a place to stay, she felt scared, and so she did end up turning, and sugarcoating it because she was scared. How would you empower a woman in that situation so she would speak out?
So the best term that I've ever heard came from one of my college professors, and she called it a woman's toolbox. So basically, you are collecting, bits and pieces of information. You're collecting money, you're collecting, clothing, you're packing a go bag, things like that. And once that woman's toolbox is full and they feel empowered enough to leave, they will. So what I would recommend for women in this situation is to reach out to an advocate at some community-based organization or your district attorney's office and talk about safety planning. That's the terminology we use. They can go over, what is this abuser's habits? When would be the safest time for you to leave? When are they gone during the day? Is there any way for you to stockpile money without them knowing? Is there a way that you can pack bags without them knowing? And ultimately, everyone's situation is different, and they're going to be able to help you specifically in your own, specific situation to have your tool bag together so that you are feeling ready and able to get out of this.
Did
that answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
And there's a hand in the back, and then I saw one also in the front. Trying to scan the audience and make sure I'm not missing people.
I would also want to add that any woman that is in a domestic violence situation, in addition, in her toolkit, she needs to have a copy of her ID,
Yes.
a copy of the children's birth certificates,
Yes.
because oftentimes abusers seize the ID, and then that limits her being able to leave.
Yes.
Yes.
That actually might be a great thing for some victims advocate groups to work on. Like these are some items to put in your toolkit for helping women or victims of any type of domestic violence or violence within the home, and saying these are some of the items when you're working with somebody you need to make sure. And if you don't have them, doesn't mean you don't have your ID, therefore you can't go past go and you can't leave. But you need your ID, you need birth certificates. These are things that'll make it easier.
And that's the other thing, is that advocates will go above and beyond for you if they're the right person. If you have found the right advocacy group that is doing all the right things, they will go above and beyond for you. They will contact the Social Security Administration on your behalf and be like, hey, what is the process? How can I get new Social Security cards for my clients? So just know that advocates want to support you in whatever way is best for you, and they will not push you. No one is going to push you to do something that you don't want to do. So make sure that you don't feel like, I'm not going to go talk to someone because they're going to tell me that I should do this, and I'm not ready for that. They're going to meet you where you're at and try and help you progress forward to the state where you feel like, okay, I'm ready, let's do this, I can get out of here. Okay.
I wanted to speak to that a little bit because my background is Amish as well. So you were asking about how to empower a woman. I would really recommend, first have her feel secure with the connection she makes before, that she has secure outside connections, and then also that the connections she makes outside understand her cultural needs, and especially if she wants to stay Amish, Like, that's very important, that where she goes to, like if she would be taken to a safe house or somewhere safe, that she knows like the environment's going to be different, but it's not going to be like this is not her life. This is just for now, for her safety, until people figure out how she can be safe within the community.
That's, yes, absolutely. And I think that it's also important to know that if, as a victim of domestic violence or I keep saying domestic violence, but it could be a victim of anything, but if as a woman and you are seeking supports with other, women within, if you want to stay Amish within your community, if you're ever seeking support from people and they say to you, you really should go back, that person is not supporting you. If somebody is telling you that they are supporting you, and in order for you to be supported, you have to go back to your abuser, that person is not supporting you. Seek other supports. All
right, so we'll
kind of
speed through I think we only have like 10 minutes.
Okay, we'll just keep going.
With a minor victim, I'm sorry. Can the courtroom be closed to spectators during the child's testimony?
That depends on the age of the child. There is what we have, you would probably be able to speak better on it. It's called the Tender Years Act.
You might actually be able to speak better on that than me.
And that is something where there can be kind of like a closed circuit, video testimony where the child doesn't actually have to physically sit in the courtroom, and they can, testify outside of the courtroom so they're not sitting near the abuser. But again, that all depends on the child's age.
Well, my concern is, especially in a lot of these plain cases, where they actually flood the courtroom with people in support of the perpetrator,
right,
being there and present to witness the child's testimony, so the child is actually being re-victimized.
Exactly.
And that will depend on the judge and the courtroom. Mm-hmm. I have to be very honest with you. It's, again,
but you are able to put on a request.
Yes, mm-hmm. Yes, you can definitely. If your prosecutor or your advocate or your officer, whoever is, in support of you, they should put out that request, even if they know it's going to get knocked down by the judge. It is something that they should put on the record. Say, just to put on the record, we are here. There is a large audience in the courtroom. I would request that it's called sequestered, which means they have to leave the courtroom while this testimony is happening. Whether or not the judge allows it is another thing. However, yes, it is definitely something that can be requested. And like I said, the Tender Years Act does account for children of a certain age, or if they have, a lower IQ or things of that nature, they can testify in a modified way to make it more comfortable for them.
Okay. All right, great, thank you.
There are also a lot of times emotional support animals, mm-hmm. That you can let your advocate know, like, hey, I think that she's going to be really nervous, and we can have an emotional support animal come into the courtroom so that they can pet something, or we can give someone a fidget toy if they mm-hmm. feel that, it's going to be something that's really difficult for them to talk about. There are ways to make it more comfortable, but it's never going to be, a comfortable thing to do, to sit in front of your abuser and talk about what happened. All right, so we kind of sped through trial. The important thing to know is that every defendant has the right to a trial, and the burden of proof, or how good our case has to be, we have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. So to different juries, that can mean different things. They have to say, they met all of the elements, all of those check boxes for this crime, and we think that there's no way that this couldn't have happened. If they have any type of doubt, they could be found not guilty. So it is a very high burden of proof, a very difficult thing to prove in some cases. Moving forward.
I got a question here from online.
Okay.
Asking, does it make a difference how many identical charges are stacked whenever the case goes to trial?
Identical charges as in?
That's all the details I had from the question, but I'm assuming, multiple counts of the same charge or whatever.
So I'm I'm so sorry. But often, the charge is generally what, at least in Pennsylvania, when a charge is brought, it's the investigating officers, generally their decision to say, we're going to charge all these. And usually what they will do, and I can't speak for everybody, and you can correct me again if I'm wrong, because there are certain elements, any crimes where those elements fit can be charged. It could be different subsections of the same charge.
Right, and that's sometimes.
And that could be 10 different incidents against one person.
Or 10 different victims. It could be one victim, it happened 10 different dates, or it can be 10 different victims that happened all at different times.
Right, so there are many reasons why, but often that is how I've seen it, where it's multiple different counts of the same crime because there's multiple different victims, or it happened on multiple different dates, or the subsection is just a little bit off. But a lot of times, and it's actually within the law, that when a person either pleads guilty or is found guilty at trial, some of those counts will merge, meaning that they can't be, sentenced to these list of crimes because they merge into one because they're essentially the same thing. I hope that answers the question. Let me know if they say anything else or have another follow-up.
So that kind of goes into the resolution. So if someone pleads guilty or is found guilty by a jury, again, that is your time to make a victim impact statement.
Uninterrupted, as I interrupt you. A victim. So at trial, a victim will testify, and the defense attorney has the opportunity to ask them questions. A victim impact statement is the victim's opportunity to speak uninterrupted. They don't get cross-examined. They don't get asked questions by the defense attorney. A victim impact statement is the victim's chance to speak to the court without being asked questions by the defense attorney.
Another thing I want to touch on is the compensation portion of the criminal justice system. So at the time of a resolution, you can be awarded restitution. So say an assault happens and, furniture is broken during that assault, or you have decided, because of this happening to me, I think it's good that I seek out counseling, and that counseling costs you money. The defendant is responsible for paying that cost. So at the time of a sentence being handed down, they will be ordered to pay restitution to you for certain things. You don't just get money because you feel like you've been wronged. That is the civil system. She will talk about that later. But in the criminal justice system, it has to be things that happen because of this crime. On top of that, there is another system, at least through the state of Pennsylvania, and I know a lot of other states have this. It's some type of victims compensation program. So these victims compensation programs are better than restitution because they will get you that money faster and you're not waiting around for the defendant to pay it. So these funds are created because every defendant has to pay $35 towards this fund. Anytime someone's found guilty, they pay $35 towards the fund. That money is allocated to you or given to you to pay for things like medical bills, or counseling expenses, or if you end up having to relocate because of abuse that you've suffered or crimes that have been committed against you, you can be reimbursed up to a certain dollar amount for those types of things. So that's another thing that you should talk with your advocate about, or your prosecutor or officer about applying for some type of victims compensation fund. Okay, so like we talked about before, some things that a good advocate will do and things that an advocate should never do. Advocates can always be present for you during an interview or a medical exam. They can advise you of the available resources, notifying you of important dates in your trial, and focusing on your best interest. Again, I'm going really quickly through this because we already went over this stuff. They should never ask you for money, okay? That is very important. The only people that would be on your side and asking you for money is people who are providing you with professional supports. So a counselor, they may have to ask you for money. If you hire a private civil attorney, they may ask you for money to represent you. That being said, a lot of community-based advocacy organizations do have those services free of cost, and it's important that you seek that out because it's just a quick application process.
That made me think of something. Also, and I guess this kind of is lumped in with never asking the victim for money, a victim's advocate should also not be gaining any sort of monetary benefit from what you are going through or what the victim is going through. So if you have an advocate that says, you know, you should file these civil charges and give me a cut of what you recover, no, absolutely not. That is never okay. Big red flag waving, go find somebody else. A victim's advocate should never be benefiting financially from your trauma.
Also, victims advocates should not speak to law enforcement for you or vice versa, tell you not to speak to law enforcement at all.
And that doesn't mean they can't go to law enforcement and say, hey, I'm representing or I'm advocating for somebody, they need something. What we're saying is they shouldn't, as I interrupt you, put words in your mouth, they shouldn't be putting words in the victim's mouth and saying, you know, don't worry about them, they're not going to speak, let me tell you what happened.
They shouldn't isolate you from any other supports. We already went over that. It's important to have a wide net of support and people who can help you in each specific way that you need help. And they should not be focusing on the interests of others. I have also seen sometimes where defense attorneys, so people who are representing the person who committed the crime, they will have victims advocates come with them and try and speak with victims. You don't have to speak with them. You don't have to speak with anyone you don't want to speak with. It's about you. We kind of talked about this already with how the criminal justice system is a little bit slower than people would expect. The other thing about criminal charges is that the victim is not the one pressing these charges, okay? So if ever there is a time where an offender, here's the situation that we often have. Victim is not able to leave the home for financial reasons, so she is still living with the offender. There are times where we will speak in private and they'll say, hey, I really want these charges to go through. I don't feel safe with this person. I want these charges to go through, but I don't want him to know that I want these charges to go through. We will always be the bad guy. The police, the prosecutor, the victim's advocate, we will be the bad guy. We will take that heat any day of the week for you. You can tell them, hey, they told me we had to go through with this, because it's true. You as the victim are not the one putting these charges on them, it's the state. It is the police that are putting the charges on them, not you. You can tell them that, you can say, hey, they wouldn't let me, you know, I tried, I told them that I didn't want to do this. Whatever's gonna keep you safest is what we want to have happen, and we will always go to bat for you. And criminal charges aren't always filed. So there are certain times, and this is a police department by police department thing. I can't speak for all police departments when I say this, but a lot of times in sexual assault cases, we know that this is a really, really difficult thing to talk about. And if you just want to come and you want to make that report and you want it to be known, we're not going to say, you know, oh, we have to prosecute this. If you are feeling like, you know, this isn't something that I could get up and say and testify about, it's not necessary that we will always prosecute charges. We do take everything that a victim says into consideration. Ultimately, what happens with the case is the decision of a prosecutor. However, we want your input. And an important reminder, you don't have to go through this alone. I hope this is what you've gathered from today, is that there are so many different types of support available for you, and this is not something that you have to do alone or that you're going to feel unsupported in. We talked about the state compensation programs. Another thing I want to talk about is making sure, if you're a parent, make sure your child knows that you are someone who is safe to disclose to. Make sure that they understand that they can come to you and talk about anything, because a lot of times when we see children not disclosing things, it's because they didn't feel comfortable or feel like they had a safe adult to disclose to. So making sure that your child knows that you are their biggest support and that, you know, they're not going to get in trouble for telling you something, that you know it's not their fault if anything were to ever happen. That's a really important conversation to have. And like we've said throughout all of this, your voice is really important and you are your own best advocate. I think that's all I have to say. I'm
far
sure we
over are
missed
we?
a lot of things, and there's a lot of questions that people probably still have. I'm gonna stick around for a little while if you guys have questions that you wanted to come up and ask.
Or we can go wherever you're gonna put us. Sorry. So you just be like, hey, stop talking.
Yeah, well, we just kind of have to try to keep it on. Yeah, thank you all for your time.